Great. So I think we're ready. So welcome. Welcome to all of our panelists and our participants. Great to see so many people reaching us from across the world. Brilliant. Really excited to be here for this conversation and see you all and get started. Now, this is a conversation that we've been really keen to have. Our community, so I'm Joanna James, I'm the Executive Director of Freedom United. And our community, who are all completely passionate about ending all forms of modern slavery, are really interested in this topic. We're going to be discussing today, what are these certification schemes about? And we're going to take a real close look at Fairtrade in particular. Some of you may know that World's Fair Trade Day was this past weekend, so we thought it fitting to take a deeper dive into the complexities of ethical consumption and sustainability in our global marketplace, and also understand the difference between fair trade, which Stefan is representing, and Fair Trade USA. So as we gather here today, we're going to confront a pivotal question, I think, and that is, does fair trade still hold meaning amidst the proliferation of certification schemes and labels? And importantly, for us as conscientious consumers, we want to know, have initiatives like fair trade really made a difference in safeguarding workers' rights and promoting sustainable practices? We know for sure that the terrain of ethical consumption is nuanced. There's so many complex considerations and trade-offs that we have to think about. And there's in the foreword of a report that's titled, "Does it do what it says on the tin?" I highlighted what I believe to be a misdirected expectation that many of these schemes with different standards and coverage put on the consumer. So, where does the responsibility lie in ensuring that workers throughout the supply chain are working in decent conditions? So as we navigate the landscape, I invite you to join us in exploring these questions, and we'll be deepening our understanding of the power and the potential of fair trade. So a big welcome from me, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Joanna, for that welcome and introduction. I'm Krista Bisnot, the Advocacy Manager at Freedom United. And thank you again for myself as well for joining us today. I'm thrilled to welcome our three brilliant speakers on the panel today. First, we have Stephen Donnelly, the Senior Campaigns Manager at the Fairtrade Foundation. Stefan is responsible for supporting the Fair Trade campaigner movement in the UK to take action and push for trade justice. Next, we have Adriana Valle, Communications Coordinator for the Fair Trade Producer Network in Latin America and the Caribbean. The network supports over 1,000 producer organizations and shares knowledge across 24 countries, empowering producers and workers in the region to advocate for their rights and interests within the fair trade movement. And fair trade as a whole is a global movement working to ensure fair prices, decent working conditions, and sustainable livelihoods for farmers and workers worldwide. And it is easily the most recognized sustainability label in the world. Finally, last but not least, we have Juliane Bing from INKOTA. Juliane is the project coordinator for West Africa Sustainable Cocoa and Chocolate at INKOTA, and INKOTA is a nonprofit fighting for dignified employment, an end to world hunger, and fair financial and trade relations in the global economy. So before we get started, just to go over what we'll be doing today, we're going to have some questions for the panel, and then we are going to have a Q&A session where you will get to put your questions to the panel. If you haven't sent your questions ahead, you can drop them in Zoom, or if you're joining us on Facebook, you can leave a comment on Facebook or Twitter, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can given our time constraints. We are streaming live, as Joanna said, on Facebook. So yeah, just before we dive in, we'd like to take a quick anonymous poll to gauge your opinions and familiarity with fair trade, and then we'll begin. All right, so let's dive in. We are going to start with Adriana. So Adriana, there are so many certification schemes, as Joanna mentioned, and ethical labels that various organizations and companies have. And earlier this year, and this was sort of the genesis of us organizing this event, there was a report published detailing exploitation of Mexican farmers, including identity documents being withheld and wages unpaid on a plantation certified by Fairtrade, two words, Fairtrade USA, and the Equitable Food Initiative. In light of this, many of our supporters were concerned, asking about Fairtrade USA, and they're also concerned about certification schemes in general and whether they're effective at safeguarding the rights and well-being of vulnerable workers. From your perspective, what went wrong with this scenario, and what differentiates fair trade, one word, from fair trade, two words, and other certification schemes?
Thank you, Krista. Well, I don't know really the particulars of this case, but I can tell you that, we have our standards, and one of the things that we have in our standards is no exploitation for workers and also for farmers. So I can tell you a little bit about the difference, because I cannot talk really from another certification, but I can say that what really separates fair trade, one word, from fair trade, two words, is that one of the things is that we have workers and farmers on board. That means that actually there's a lot of representations of workers and farmers in all our different, like in the General Assembly of Fairtrade International, in all the changes that we make to the standards, there's consultations with workers and with farmers. And sometimes actually that is really something very different, like what we had last year. We had an increase in the minimum price in coffee. And actually Fairtrade USA said we don't want to, just agree with this increase of the minimum price in coffee. That was something that farmers were asking for a long time, since the price in coffee has been like the same for over a decade. So, I mean, that's something that actually differentiates Fairtrade. Fairtrade really listens to the farmers and to the workers. And it is also related to the origin of Fairtrade. We have our certification scheme was built in Mexico in the 80s, and it really started with a group of indigenous coffee producers that, along with all the support from Father Francis van der Hof from the Netherlands, they just started to do a different type of trade, a trade that really wants to develop a relationship between the producers and the consumers. And it's something that we really want to work for the dignity of human beings and just give the producers, the farmers, and the workers what they deserve, because we know that conventional trade is very unfair. At the end, farmers end up, just receiving less than what they need to produce the coffee, the bananas, or the different products that they do, and just the living conditions remain, the same, the poverty, the discrimination. So Fairtrade, it really wants to change things through trade. That's why the first slogans, and I think Stefan can also comment on that, were like fair trade, not aid. It is more effective if you give organizations, especially farmers and workers, what they deserve.
Thank you so much, Adriana. And that is exactly what our community is interested in. Our community is well aware that many products that we use every day is linked to forms of exploitation and modern slavery, and they are trying to have a better relationship when it comes to what are they buying, what choices are they making. And so that's a really great explanation of what fair trade is and what your goals are. And I'm going to turn to Juliane now. Given INKOTA's mandate, we think that you're well placed to answer the question of the day, the question of the webinar, which is when it comes to addressing the most severe forms of labor exploitation, such as forced child labor, does fair trade actually work? And if you could share, in your opinion, what the strengths and shortcomings are of their approach.
Thanks, Krista. So I'm going to answer this question by speaking about the cocoa sector and cocoa production in West Africa, more specifically about Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, where about 60% of the world's cocoa is produced, because that's the sector I work in, and so that's where my expertise lies. So to give you some context about cocoa production in West Africa, about 1.5 million children are involved in child labor on cocoa farms, and it's estimated that about 10,000 of these children are victims of forced child labor and child trafficking. So often they're trafficked from neighboring countries such as Mali or Burkina Faso into, for example, Cote d'Ivoire, where they're then forced to work on cocoa farms. And the reason why so many children work on cocoa farms, a small percentage of them, as I just mentioned, in forced labor, is that poverty is endemic to the cocoa sector in West Africa. So cocoa producers in West Africa only earn about 6% of the value of a conventional chocolate bar that is sold in supermarkets in Europe. They don't make any profits usually off of the cocoa they sell. And this means that poverty is very widespread, and with that poverty come a whole wide range of human rights abuses, one of which is forced labor, child labor, for example. So these issues are very widespread in the cocoa sector. The producers don't earn a living income, so they're not able to, for example, invest in their farms. They're not able to hire labor that is not their children, for example. And so that's why, for example, cocoa producers then have to use their children to work on the farm. So just to give a brief kind of introduction, so fair trade is also very well known in the cocoa sector. I think, yeah, it's one of the products that is most well known to be certified by Fairtrade. So as Adriana mentioned, the fair trade standard does not allow child labor, does not allow forced labor. And so it's very strictly forbidden in their standard. They do a lot of, in their standards and in working with the farmers, there's a lot of awareness creation, sensitizations, education, support to the cooperatives themselves so that they are able to, for example, remediate cases of child labor when it becomes known on a farm, for example, or in the value chain of the chocolate manufacturer. However, from our point of view, these measures aren't sufficient enough. One of the shortcomings Fairtrade currently has is that the premiums they pay still aren't high enough to close the living income gap for cocoa farmers. That means that even with the certification premium that Fairtrade cocoa farmers receive, they are not able to reach the kind of threshold of a living income, and therefore many of them still live in poverty. So that's one of the main points we criticize as a weakness of fair trade, that the premiums they pay aren't high enough. But another, I think, big issue in the cocoa sector, and this is not linked solely to fair trade, is that a lot of cocoa, so about 50% of cocoa currently, is not traceable back to the farm level. This means that the kind of, if you have a chocolate bar in your hand, even if it's fair trade certified, and fair trade does say this themselves, there's no 100% guarantee that there is not child labor or possibly forced labor in that bar of chocolate. And this is a big issue, that there's still this lack of traceability. In the fair trade system, for example, there's mass balance. That means that cocoa that has been produced by certified farmers can be mixed with non-certified cocoa. So there's also that kind of also weakens the traceability, for example, of if you have something where a product where you see the fair trade label on that, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of the cocoa in there has been certified. So there are those weaknesses and shortcomings, but I think we'll touch upon this later. It's not, in our point of view, not the sole responsibility of fair trade or certification standards as a whole. They cannot solve this issue on their own, but I think we'll touch on that later. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Juliane. And I think we're going to turn to Stefan, and you've actually posed a few issues that we were going to ask Stefan, so that works out very nicely. Stefan, if you could speak to a couple of the issues Juliane brought up about cocoa, particularly the mass balance approach, and whether this might mean that even though Fairtrade has a standard of no child labor, you might have child labor and forced child labor at that in your supply chain. And more broadly, if you could tell us what Fairtrade's stance is on child labor, given this fact, and also given that in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana and most parts of the world, children do work. So given this, and I'm sure Fairtrade is aware of this, what are the standards pertaining to child workers, and what input do you receive from children themselves regarding these standards?
Yes. Yeah, I'll start with I think there's 2 points there on child labor and the mass balance traceability. They're linked, I should say. So I'll start with the Fairtrade's approach to child labor, and I asked my colleagues who work on this more directly, so I'm reading from some notes here. But I think Juliane gave a pretty good summary actually of Fairtrade's approach on this. So I won't linger too long, but I think 3 main ways we do are through those certification standards, so which set out rules on child labor, but also support farmers to address the root causes. So for example, traders are required to support farmers in their child labor prevention efforts. The fair trade prices and premium, so that the fair trade minimum price, for people who don't know, essentially acts as a safety net. So when the market prices crash, as they do quite frequently in cocoa and some other crops, farmers at least get the fair trade minimum income, which is calculated by looking at the cost of production, and they get the fair trade premium on top of that. We do also have an optional, and it is optional, living income reference prices, which some companies that want to go above and beyond will pay to help close that living income gap that Juliane mentioned. And just on the point, and it's a fair point, that premiums would need to be higher to close that living income gap if we did that. And generally, the process for setting those is done as Adriana said, Fairtrade's a network which has farmers and workers involved in the governance, in setting our standards and in setting our premiums. So when we consult on what the minimum price, what the premiums should be, they are involved in that. But the truth is companies are also involved in that. And what we'll sometimes hear is farmers may not always want the prices to go up because then they think, well, I won't be able to sell my product anymore. And it's, yeah, to come back, I'll come back to this point later, but I think probably the question of the webinar of does Fairtrade work? I think it depends what we want Fairtrade to do. So when I try to explain Fairtrade, I say it's a tool really for the farmers and workers to use, and it's a tool they can use to earn fairer incomes, have more rights, have a stronger voice as part of a global system. And in this context, it's a tool that they can use to tackle child labour, to tackle forced labour, as no one wants to be, very few people want to be engaging in that. As Juliane said, the root cause is poverty. So Fairtrade's a tool to do that, but it's never going to be the answer on its own, and certification is never going to be the answer on its own. The whole of trade needs to change, not just a tiny little section somewhere in the corner. And that's why Fairtrade's also a sort of a wider campaign movement. And that's why, yeah, the Fairtrade system is set up like that. But anyway, that's a bit from the side. The other point on preventing child labour is, and Juliane touched on this as well, but programmes offered by the Fairtrade producer networks, of which Adriana is one representative. So providing extra resources and support, monitoring remediation efforts to deal with that. As you say, it's in a lot of the world, it's not uncommon for children to work, and there's a difference between a teenager helping out on their family farm in the same way they might do in the USA or in the UK at the weekends or for the school holidays. So there are provisions in the Fairtrade standards that say children are only allowed to help out on their family farms under strict conditions. The work must be age appropriate and done outside school hours during holidays, for example. So that's how we do try and address those things. And as much as the standards may sound prohibitive, that's really not the intention. So we don't want farmer organisations to be punished for, in a way, if farmer organisations are going out of their way to identify child labour, stop it, and then long-term prevent that. That's actually better than someone just brushing it under the carpet. So we don't want to be completely punitive in that situation either. And I suppose then to touch on the point around mass balance, which yeah, I think Juliane explained well. So yeah, mass balance it's not a sort of fair trade design system. It's really just mimics how the wider COCA sector worked, and there is a problem and has been for a long time of traceability there. And the reason it does exist in the fair trade system is essentially if we didn't embrace the mass balance model, which the rest of the sector uses, it would limit the amount that fair trade farmers could sell. If we had total traceability, it would be more difficult for farmers to raise their incomes through fair trade COCA. And to say as fair trade is very much led by farmers' needs, and that's often where we start. So mass balance, what mass balance means is that the company, it's quite hard to explain actually, but the company that is producing a chocolate bar that has a fair trade mark on it has to have bought that volume of COCA to cover all the COCA that is in the chocolate bars that have the fair trade mark on them. So the farmers are getting the income from fair trade, but it is true to say that the COCA that is physically in the bar that you're eating may not be entirely certified. But the logic behind it is that's just how the COCA system works at the moment, and we don't want to deny farmers' income by not engaging with that system. But yeah, in the long term, of course, we want to see a lot more traceability, and that's something my colleagues who work with these companies are pushing for, that there is a lot more traceability in the future. And I think with all issues coming up around deforestation regulation and things like that, that does seem to be the direction of travel. So hopefully there will be some progress on that.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefan, for covering all of that. Next, I'm going to move back to Adriana. There have been concerns that while some certification schemes benefit small farmers, for instance, in Latin America and the Caribbean, with more involvement in decision making and higher wages and so on, these benefits do not extend to farm workers. So farm workers may have the same conditions, working conditions that they do on Fairtrade or other certified farms as they do on uncertified farms. How or can Fairtrade tackle this blind spot?
Yeah, thank you, Krista, for the question. Actually, it's very interesting because that's a concern that we have for some time, but now it's part of the standard. So producer organization that wants to be Fairtrade certified has to comply with the International Labor Organization conventions. So that means just having good working conditions for their people. If they hire labor, which it happens, because sometimes for harvesting, you need like temporary workers, or, it really depends on the product. But now they, to be able to maintain the Fairtrade certification, they need to have good working conditions. So that's an upgrade that it was just included recently into the SPO, the Small Producer Organization Standards in Fairtrade. But also, I would like to add that here in Latin America, we have been also working to promote human rights and labor rights with workers in plantations, because we have what we call the small producer organization, but also we have higher labor organizations which are certified. And to be able to be certified in Fairtrade for a plantation, they need to comply with all labor laws. And also with, we have an external auditor, which is FlowCert. They conduct yearly audits. So if they find out that there's like a plantation that is not really complying with woodworking conditions, they give the plantation like a prevention. But at the end, if they don't really remediate the situation, they could lose the certification. So that's important to know. But also, we've been working with this workers network in 10 countries in Latin America. And what we've been doing is just working on leadership, working on also, human and labor rights, just, so that when people are aware of their rights, then it's easier for them to demand them, in the different scenarios they live. So we are really proud of the work we do. And also we have one representative from workers in our board in CLAP, which is very important for us, because we really see coming back to the question, does Fairtrade really work? In what Stefan was explaining about the premium, for instance, in plantations, it is a workers' committee that decides what the premium is used for. So we have many different stories of workers deciding to improve housing conditions for some of them. We also have stories of workers investing in education, which is quite nice. We have workers that start, just doing some regular job at a plantation, and then they move up the ladder because they get education, and then they you know, they get education from these scholarships that they decide collectively they want to give up with the premium. So it's quite interesting to see how workers are empowered, how they are more organized, thanks to also, being a requirement for plantations to have these workers committees that can decide how to use this premium. So thank you.
Thank you. Moving along to Stefan, because time is of the essence. Most consumers are more familiar with fair trade food products like chocolate, but you also work with cotton producers. And that's an industry that we're very concerned with at Freedom United, as several reports in the past few years have linked the majority of the world's cotton supply to forced labor in the Uyghur region of China. And so many companies are reassessing their supply chains right now. Could you tell us a bit about the challenges in meeting the demand for fair trade cotton, and what measures are in place to ensure fair working conditions for cotton farmers and workers?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And I know fair trade cotton has been one of it's grown quite a lot over the past couple of years in terms of the production and the sales. And possibly, yeah, in reaction to some of those issues. So it's grown in a number of countries across the world. It's not grown in China, but it is grown in Kyrgyzstan, India, Senegal, Pakistan, a couple of others. But yeah, it in a way it has unique challenges to cotton, but also has similar challenges to a lot of the other commodities that we work in. And I think when we did a study on this a few years ago, one of the chief benefits were quite similar to what Adriana was describing a minute ago, in that it's the fair incomes that you get for cotton growers, and the opportunity to earn that fair trade premium, which is frequently invested either to top up incomes or to fund projects. I think in cotton schools in particular, and educational things were quite popular. And also just to invest back in the business so it can make more money in future. Those benefits are quite common across fair trade. But what one of the studies showed is actually one of the main benefits is almost the lack of the negative things associated with the conventional cotton sector. So a lot of things like forced overtime, unpaid or delayed wages, and yeah, child labor again. So as we discussed, the fair trade standards, and both the standards referenced on workers and I think mainly in cotton it is actually small producers growing it themselves. But yeah, the workers' rights, there are strong protections there, and those are as again with everything fair trade system, subject to our independent auditing from FlowCert, which is a completely independent body, and we cannot change or overrule the results of their audit. So yeah, there is that independent oversight, which is actually a bit different than most major fair trade 2 words or ethical certification systems. So yeah, that's one of the main challenges. It's a little bit different, but I noticed someone mentioned it in the chat. One of the other big challenges more generally in cotton is it's got a big environmental footprint. The fair trade standards also include a lot of measures around making sure there's not excessive water waste, for example, which is a big project there, that there's not lots of pollution that destroys the local environment. And some fair trade producers will use in cotton and elsewhere as well, but will use their extra income to invest in getting organic certification as well, which is better for the environment, is lower climate footprint, but also in the long term helps increase incomes because they can demand a higher price for organic cotton. It's true of things like tea and coffee as well. So yeah, there's some of the main challenges, or well, some of the main challenges and some of the benefits Fairtrade cotton can offer. Yeah, I know you can be offered to send out some links afterwards, so I can send out some links of where people can get that, and it does vary across the world. I think it's quite multinational, but there's quite a few here in the UK, and I think in the US as well now. So yeah, definitely one to look out for, and an interesting sector that Fairtrade's working in at the moment.
Thank you. Thanks, Stefan. And yes, we'll be sharing links in a follow-up email tomorrow. So moving on to Juliane, given what you've said previously about fair trade, I can already tell that you're not necessarily advising people to not support fair trade. So I guess what advice do you have in general for persons who are undecided, but are interested in buying chocolate or clothing or, you know, food products, but they don't want to contribute to exploitative systems, and maybe they're unsure of what they should.
Thanks, Krista. So yeah, this is a question we get very often from consumers, and I mean I totally understand. I think, you know, if you're at the supermarket, the grocery store, and you're, you know, in front of the chocolate shelf, and you're concerned by child labor or by environmental destruction, you don't want to buy a chocolate that has contributed to that. So I think first and foremost, buying fair trade is better than buying non-fair trade chocolate. I think that's my first answer to that question. But it was mentioned in Joanna's introduction, actually. I don't believe that consumers should bear the sole responsibility for, you know, buying or making sure that human rights issues or abuses are come to an end in different global supply chains of the products we buy. That is the role of governmental regulations, and that's the responsibility of the companies, because they do have a responsibility to respect human rights. And here in the EU, the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive was just passed. So that's a new law that will require all companies operating in the EU that have a certain size to respect human rights, to publish reports detailing how they will do that. And for us NGOs that campaign for a long time for these kinds of regulations to become a reality, we really hope that this will become a game changer, so that all companies have the same kind of legal obligation to respect human rights, and that certifications aren't the only kind of a system working towards that. Because as we've kind of heard in this discussion now, certification can only kind of go so far in trying to improve the situation, or respect for social and environmental standards. To become more concrete, I think what consumers can do is definitely put pressure on their lawmakers in the countries they're in. It's nice to see that so many people from around the world are participating in this webinar. So there are only a few countries and regions around the world where there's actually a legal obligation for companies to respect human rights. So if you're in a country that does not have a law like that yet, put pressure on your policymakers. That's the first thing I would suggest. And the second is there are resources out there, such as the chocolate scorecard, which are quite easy to use. They rate different chocolate companies, chocolate manufacturers, and retailers operating in Europe, North America, Australia, I believe, and show very clearly how these companies are doing in different aspects of sustainability. So how they're doing in fighting child labor, paying fair prices, respecting the environment, things like that. So the chocolate scorecard gives a good overview. I think Freedom United is involved in that project as well. So that's a good piece of advice. I think there are a few companies that are really doing very good work in showing that it's possible to pay higher prices but still produce for the mass market. One of those companies is Tony's Chocolonely. They, at least here in Germany, they're quite well known. They pay a living income reference price. They work with Fairtrade, but then they pay an extra premium, for example, extra to the Fairtrade premium to close the living income gap. And their supply chain is 100% traceable. They work with cooperatives directly. They have long-standing relationships. I visited Tony's cooperatives in Cote d'Ivoire, and they're very happy with kind of the price they're receiving and the how they've been able to use that to invest in their communities and things like that. So yeah, there are definitely products out there that you can buy with a, let's say, good conscience. Great, thanks.
Thank you, Juliane. Thank you so much for all the tips. And yes, we are part of the Chocolate Scorecard Initiative, and I'll include that in the links and follow up in tomorrow's email. So before we move on to the Q&A from the audience, I just wanted to quickly run the poll again to see if anything's changed since we began the discussions.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you very much to our speakers who we're still going to hear from, but thank you for answering some of those tricky questions. We've got a lot of questions that have already come in from the audience. Some have come in advance, and some, of course, are in the Q&A. We've tried to answer some of them live. I'm going to try and wrap up a couple here as well. And if there are a lot outstanding, we'll try and make sure that we manage them, because having a discussion is super important. For those who are present in the webinar, so not the questions that I have in advance, I will ask you if you'd like to ask your question live so that you can just unmute. I know that not everybody's able to do that, so I'll give you the opportunity to do that so that we can hear from you directly. So I feel the question I just want to tackle straight on is from Tori. Tori, are you able to answer your question? We can just give you the ability to unmute.
Hi, yeah, I was just wondering if there's any particular positioning that Freedom United has taken on fair trade. And thanks for all of this. This is really great, by the way.
Thank you, Tori. And actually, I'm just going to take Sue West Jones's question as well at the same time, because I would like to answer them together. So Sue, are you able to ask your question, please?
Yes, hello. It was really just a case of seeking guidance in terms of the choices that we make at the checkout. I have heard, of course, that it is not just about consumer choices, but actually consumers drive the market. So it was just about seeking clear guidance as to what we can accept as good enough and what isn't good enough.
Great, thank you, Sue. So I'll answer both those questions together because I do think they are very interrelated. And I'll also echo what Juliane had already said, and I think the fact that, of course, Sue, that, one needs guidance is just indicative of how challenging it is as consumers to have that responsibility. It's a job in itself to actually know what different certification schemes mean before you even investigate how they're applied and whether they're effective or not, or where they may have shortcomings. Do they include labor rights as well as, say, the environment? Or there's so many issues that are tied up in the different certification schemes in a real plethora. And for that reason, I 100% agree with Juliane that I don't think it's the responsibility of the consumer to ensure that the products that we buy are produced by people who are working in minimum labor conditions. I mean, these are minimum standards, minimum standards that are set out by international law. That should be a given, right? That should be a given. And it's not a given because regulations are not strong enough. But as Juliane said, we're pushing for more strong regulations. But I 100% agree with you, Sue, that we have influence and power as consumers and as citizens. So for sure, when we see opportunities to progress the agenda, to call out where there are weaknesses in the implementation of standards, or to call for stronger regulations. And of course, that's what we'll do. And that's why the Freedom Unite community is so important, because that's a big, powerful community that can come in and take action and make a powerful call for change and support all the efforts that people like Juliane are doing day in, day out, getting to understand the real detail on a specific product and really know where we need to see the change and what kind of change we need to see. So I hope that Freedom United gives you a way to be able to use your power to create change, not just through consumer practices, which I think you can do to an extent, but realistically, we don't have the visibility through the supply chain of most of the products that we buy to really know what's happening. We combine that though with getting stronger regulations and making sure that businesses are adhering to minimum standards, then we can be effective. Okay, so let me go and look at the questions that we have from that came in advance. We do have a really important question, which I think is really interesting, about the role of governments in supporting the fair trade system. So Robert says, I've heard that over 21 countries' governments support the fair trade certified system. Is it true? And if it is, do fair trade certified products receive any tariff reduction by those countries to provide a more competitive position in the market? So I think that'd probably be a question for Stefan.
Yeah, I'm not aware of this, and Adriana, please jump in if it's not correct. I'm not aware, and that's not to say it's not the case, but I'm not aware that fair trade producers receive tariff reductions. I guess there may be different trade deals across different countries. I'm not aware of, but yeah, I'm not aware of any that do that.
No, I don't think there's a special tariff or anything like that. And actually, I think we have some governments that actually have a fair trade policy. Like in Latin America, we have one in Ecuador, which is like a national policy to promote fair trade. But then what we work mostly is with cities and towns, which, it is because people that are like living in towns are closer to producers as well. But we know that in Europe, you have a big movement of fair trade cities and towns. Maybe, Stefan, you want to comment on that?
Yeah. So we have a lot of governments have certainly made commitments, and everything from local governments at city and town level all the way up to national governments, like for example in Scotland and Wales here, they have strong fair trade commitments. I don't think at the moment it extends to discounted tariffs on anything. It's an interesting idea, particularly as we touched upon, there's regulations that's recently come in the EU and elsewhere around sustainable production. So incentivizing that with, I guess, a bit of carrot as well as the stick of that would be certainly seems like an interesting idea to explore. But yeah, it's not something I'm aware of at the moment. But yeah, that's definitely, as we touched upon, encouraging governments to take action is as much a part of what we see our jobs as encouraging consumers to choose fair trade.
Thank you. So there's a couple of questions about the practicalities of how fair trade works. Ellen Klein and Sharon Burt, now I'm going to ask you to speak out your questions. Ellen, if you'd like to go first. You'll need to unmute. Click on the microphone button. If you're not able to, is Sharon available to ask your question, Sharon?
Hello. Yes. Hi. I was wondering if certification meant the businesses received some sort of monetary compensation, because I heard about certain education experiences being offered and other things.
Thank you, Sharon. And I think also Ellen's question is about what is the fair trade premium, a very straightforward question that I think, Stephen, you're about to type an answer to. And perhaps you could also loop in if fair trades can control or have a disclaimer on their products that are not 100% fair trade. I think this is going back to the mass balance question.
Yeah, so yeah, I'll try to cover all of those. Sharon's, first of all, sorry, my mind's gone blank. What was Sharon's question again?
Sharon's still here. She can repeat it.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering whether there was any kind of money offered to businesses that receive certification, because I heard about education and different things being offered. I was wondering what the source was, whether these businesses were coming up with it on their own or there's some other incentive.
Yes. So the businesses, do you mean the producers who are, say, growing the coca, for example?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So yes, and yeah, that basically is the fair trade premium, or the higher incomes are able to earn through fair trade. But what the fair trade premium is essentially is an extra payment on top of the price the producers receive for the coca, that the business, the buyer, has to pay them if they're buying it on fair trade terms. That, as Adriana mentioned, that's regularly assessed and updated in accordance with market conditions. That's an extra payment which will come from the buyer, generally a coca trader or maybe a direct coca producer, chocolate producer. And then the collection of farmers, if it's a small producer organization, will decide democratically how to spend that. So they can choose to spend it on projects like education, medical facilities. They can choose to top up incomes with it. They can choose to invest it back into the business to make that more profitable in future. So that's what it is essentially. And I'll put a link in the chat to explain the fair trade premium. So yeah, I appreciate we sometimes say that without mentioning what it was. And then the final one was about the labeling, I think, on that. So yeah, it is, and I should say even with mass balance, I think the crucial point is that company has bought all the coca it needs to cover the products it's producing. So the farmers aren't getting shortchanged in any way. The coca has been bought to do that, but it is clearly labelled. You can look, there'll be an arrow next to the fair trade mark, and then there'll be a thing on the back which will give you a link to go and find out more. And we can also include that in the links tomorrow. But yeah, it is labelled there slightly differently than the standard fair trade mark.
Thank you, Stefan. In fact, I have another question for you quickly before I go back to Adriana.
I think Adriana might have something to add on that. Did you have your hand up?
She has got her hand up, yeah, but I was just going to quickly just jump in first. But I will come back to you, Adriana, because it's about the process on fair trade. Sandra asked us in advance whether the Fair Trade Foundation can put pressure on wholesale suppliers to either big chains or small traders to actually stock fair trade products. She said that her group, who are active in supporting Fairtrade, find that stock is limited.
Yeah, I mean, that's very much our job, really, to try and encourage, as I said, it is our job to encourage political change, but it's also our job to try and get as many wholesalers, retailers, whoever across the UK to sell Fairtrade. And is, as I've touched on a few points, a few times, it's I guess a multi-pronged thing, that it's partly about consumer demand as well. Like, businesses will sell it if they think there's a demand, and that's why, as a few people have mentioned in the chat, things like Fairtrade towns and communities are actually really important, because it shows there is that local demand at a local level. And you'll generally find, if there's a lot of Fairtrade campaigning in an area, those supermarkets will stock more stuff. It's not always the case. But yeah, at a national level, of course, yeah, we're really pushing for more people to stock Fairtrade, so more farmers can earn more.
Thank you, Stefan. Adriana, please, your contribution. Then I have a question afterwards for Juliana, and we are getting close to the hour, but we have a couple more questions to go, so we may just go slightly over so that we can answer all your questions. Adriana.
Yeah, thank you. Well, what I was going to add is only that really price is really important. And what happens is, I mean, if you look at a Fairtrade product in the supermarket, it's probably a little bit more expensive. So, I mean, that's a choice that you as a consumer have to make, you know, because what we say is like, it is important for us, because then you are paying the producer what it costs to produce that good. You know, if you think about coffee, then you're paying the organization what it really costs to just to be able to grow and process that coffee. So, I mean, I think consumers have a lot of power as well, but as it has been said previously, certifications cannot really, I mean, cannot change a whole reality. We know that there's a lot of poverty, there's a lot of human rights abuses in the whole world. And of course, certifications like Fairtrade really contribute, you know, to make things a little bit better. But really, we also need the consumer power to do a lot more changes. And it's not only about choosing different products, but also asking your governments, your companies, you know, to abide to all these principles, to respect human rights. Sometimes what we see is that companies respect human rights in some countries, but not in others. So, I mean, that's something that you really, I think it's a big opportunity for Freedom United also, you know, to be able to support and people respecting labor laws all over. And as I said, you know, Fairtrade is a tool. So very welcome for everybody to really support the Fairtrade system and the tool that we have.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad you brought up the issue of price, because I think, you know, this is often what we're not talking about, and that is, where is the cost? Where's the cost in the production of many of the goods that we're consuming? And, you know, if we're actually ensuring that the whole process of bringing that good to market is done in an equitable way, then the cost is vastly different often from what we're used to. And so is there a question of how we adjust our consumption? And that brings me to a question to Juliane, which is around how INKOTA proposes to reconcile this pursuit of ethical consumption with the pragmatic realities of global trade. Of course, it's very difficult to, as we've heard, for consumers to discern between genuine efforts to promote fairness and those that might actually inadvertently perpetuate status quo. And perhaps, I know this is very specific, Juliane, but, you know, just as illustrative purposes, Eva did have a question that I'm going to just ask for you, Eva, about she was interested to know the percentage of chocolate that is certified. I think you mean of all chocolate that's certified fair trade. And I think that's also quite telling, probably, if you've got that figure of this broader question that I framed that's really triggered by Adriana's comment on how we as consumers, how the global system works. Thank you, Juliane.
Yeah, so I think to answer the more specific question of how much chocolate is fair trade certified, possibly the fair trade speakers are better placed to answer that. But I can give you an example from Germany. So on the German market, about 85 to 90% of all chocolate products are certified. So not only fair trade certified, but certified by other standards as well. So really a large majority of chocolate here is certified. But that's also because there's been really a proliferation of certifications and standards in the past few years. It really shows that there is large consumer interest and demand in consuming more ethically. But just because something is advertised as certified or sustainable, that doesn't mean that's necessarily the case. I mean, there are also other standards and certifications that are not fair, so apart from fair trade, for example, one is Rainforest Alliance. I think they have a larger market share, at least in Germany, than Fairtrade. And there have also been chocolate manufacturers that used to be Fairtrade certified and that are now Rainforest Alliance certified. And one of the reasons for that is that the Rainforest Alliance premium is much, much lower than what Fairtrade pays. So there really are big differences between the standards and the certifiers. And that brings me back to the point Adriana made of talking about price. So sustainability and sustainable consumption is not free. It has a price. And for, farmers, be it cocoa farmers or cotton farmers or, those working on fruit plantations, for example, if they are to produce sustainably, meaning respecting human rights, protecting the environment, they need to have the financial means to do so. Otherwise, these, systems that currently exist will just continue and be proliferated. So the exploitation won't stop unless the price is right, and the price needs to be much higher that is paid to producers all around the world for the labor they put into producing the products that we consume.
Indeed, and of course we campaign hard to have a guaranteed living wage for small producers included in the corporate social due diligence directive. I think I've got that slightly wrong. The new law that Juliane was talking about that just passed in the EU, because the challenge, of course, is making sure that that extra revenue also reaches all the way down the supply chain, and that's not as easily said as done. But I'm glad that you brought up the differences between the Fairtrade and Rainforest Alliance, because David also asked, he wasn't clear why the prices are different and what, the advantages are for fair trade. Why, should we be looking for specific type of certification schemes over another? And I think, Stephen, do you want to jump in here?
Sure. So can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, so Juliane just mentioned the fact that there are products that have shifted from being Fairtrade certified to being Rainforest Alliance certified. David also wrote into us to say that he understood that it was cheaper to retail the Rainforest Alliance certified products. So his question was, what's the difference? And I think this is, why is it cheaper? What's the difference? What's the advantage of fair trade certification?
Yeah, I think it's similar to what Adriana said at the start, really. But I think that the key things about fair trade, and it's difficult to make blanket statements because Rainforest Alliance and Fairtrade have very long standard documents, but what the things that are unique about Fairtrade really is the Fairtrade minimum price, which I don't think is generally replicated in there. The model of the Fairtrade premium, which that that model where producers are able to decide themselves democratically how to use that money. And the fact that producers are involved in the governance of Fairtrade, so they 50% of the sort of global governing body is made up of producer representatives. There's 3 producer networks around the world. But in a very top line, it's income. Fairtrade will, if it's Fairtrade certified, the amount they will, the trader or the buyer will have to pay is generally higher than it is with most other certification bodies and with Rainforest Alliance in particular.
Thanks for explaining that. And I also see that Eva's, I should have let you ask your question, Eva, yourself, because you were explaining that actually your question was around the proportion of a chocolate bar that is certified, that's actually ethically sourced. Now, of course, a chocolate bar's got a lot of ingredients in it, and sugar is obviously a big ingredient in a chocolate bar besides cocoa. You know, one of the questions, of course, is, you know, what actually entitles you to use that certification label, considering not just the proportion perhaps of the cocoa itself, which I would hope is 100% if it is the cocoa certified, but also the actual ingredient versus other ingredients that could or should be certified. So perhaps you could just wrap up with this very specific, but I think important question to understand what exactly we're talking about.
No, it's an important question, and one we get a lot, so thankfully I do have an answer to it. So we actually, you might notice there's 2 slightly different Fairtrade marks, and there's a couple, but 2 main ones, and one is what we call, probably the one you'll recognise, the All That Can Be mark, which is the black background, green and blue, sort of hand in the middle. And that means that anything that can be certified as Fairtrade within that chocolate bar, for example, is certified. So that includes sugar, also might include vanilla, which is in quite a lot of chocolate bars. There's a slightly different one which has a white background, which is if there is 1 Fairtrade ingredient within that, or maybe 2, but not everything that can be within that is certified as Fairtrade. So that you may sometimes see a chocolate bar with that on it, and that means the cocoa in there is, and you're right, it's always 100% Fairtrade. So that can go on there unless it's 100% Fairtrade. But that says, yes, the cocoa is sourced as Fairtrade, but the all ingredients may not be.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you very much for explaining that. And I think that just goes to show how complicated this whole area is. And I think, and I don't expect that everyone's come away with complete clarity as to what the topic is. But I hope at least it's given you a bit more insight into how it works. Do we have results of the survey, or are we going to share those later? Krista?
Yes, well, I was going to share them later, but I can share them now. So at the beginning, we asked, of course, now everybody is familiar with Fairtrade, so I won't go over that one. But yes, you can see here, before 48% of participants said that Fairtrade works, and now 60% of participants think that Fairtrade works. So yes, this conversation has definitely made an impact.
Great. Thank you so much, Krista. That's really useful to see, and I think gives us an idea of what we have learned. And I think, yeah, it's a complex field, but the most important thing is that we just need to be clear about what we're all expecting when we're buying the goods that we're buying, and make our expectations evident to our representatives, our political representatives, our policymakers, our legislators, and making sure that we have the kind of strong regulations and laws that are going to make sure that companies do what they need to do to respect human rights, as Juliane said. And of course, Freedom United, if we see an opportunity where we can use our voice and come together and make sure that happens, then we'll of course be definitely letting you know. But at this point, I just want to thank again this great panel. Thank you very much to Stefan, to Adriana, and to Juliane for taking the time to explain to us how fair trade works and all the things that we should consider. And I think we got to some of the really difficult questions, so I'm really pleased about that. Thank you to the participants, especially for all your brilliant questions. And we've gone over time, but it's absolutely worth it to hear the answers to really pertinent questions that you've put to us. I hope you found this useful. We will be sharing a link by email to this conversation, so you'll be able to watch the recording and share it. And if you can make a small donation for us to be able to continue to do events like this, please do that on our website. Be very, very grateful. We are community funded. If you've got ideas for other events you'd like us to organise, please drop us a line and let us know. So big thank you, and thank you very much as well to my colleague Krista for chairing the discussion and organising it with the team in the background, making sure that it all ran smoothly. Have a brilliant rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.